having completed her PhD doctorate on archaeological work in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, which was formerly known as Northwest Frontier Province, NWFP, Pakistan, in the Department of Archaeological Sciences, University of Bradford, where she also studied for her MPhil and undergraduate degree before completing her doctorate. She now works mainly with the school's distant learning program. She works in South Asia and parts of Middle East like Iran, Oman, and Lebanon. And currently she's focusing, especially her work focuses currently on historical and contemporary archaeology in these regions, as well as exploring post-conflict archaeology. Besides her well-known publications, The Archaeology of South Asia, From the Indus to Ashoka, which consists on the era of 6,500 BCE to 200 BCE, Cambridge 2015, and Agriculture and Pastoralism in the Late Bronze and Early Iron Age, Northwest Frontier Province, Pakistan, Oxford 2003. She has written several articles on archaeological site damages, assessments, and exploration, and especially the suggesting what should be the way forward for such sites and such archaeological monuments. She is currently undertaking research in Pakistan, Iran, and Oman. Her areas of interest include various subjects, including ideology and social organization, and she is increasingly interested in working in the recent past and combining different approaches to explore different ways of understanding in the past. As I told you, the topic of our dissertation today is the role of heritage in communities with reference to Makli. Let me welcome Dr. Ruth Yong.
What a great honor it is to be here and to thank both the Ministry of Heritage, Culture and Antiquities and also the Endowment Trust Fund of Karachi for their generous support both of all the scholarship and the work at the site and of this incredibly important first international conference here at Makli. I am an archaeologist, and for me one of the most important areas of archaeology is heritage, because it is in heritage that we start to see an intersection between the past and the present, and the way the past informs the present, the way people in the present understand the past. And of course, heritage sites that are historical sites, but that are understood and appreciated in the present. Now, what I'm going to talk about today really is about the Makli World Heritage Site and its public reception. I started to think about Makli as an incredibly important World Heritage Site, an incredibly important necropolis, the biggest necropolis in the world, certainly the biggest Islamic necropolis in the world. And I started to think, why is it that this site is so little understood and so little known outside Pakistan and outside scholarly understanding? And that's really where this talk begins, where it began for me anyway, in thinking about things. And there are three things that I want to do in this talk today. The first is to have a look at this whole concept of World Heritage, UNESCO World Heritage, and perhaps critique it a little. Instead of thinking of it as automatically a good thing, to begin to think about what it really means and where it's really come from. There's no time to do that in depth, so I'll just look at a few issues and ideas. And then I want to think about tourism itself and how it's becoming such a huge phenomenon worldwide, and possibly what it might mean for heritage sites such as Makli, which is hoping clearly to develop itself as a heritage and tourist site in the future. Then I'd also like to look at Makli, finally, and its public reception, how the public see Makli, particularly how international tourists see Makli and what their views are. Now, I'm not going to offer any sort of solutions, but I just want to raise issues and ideas in this talk. So Makli and World Heritage. Well, this is a World Heritage Mission from 1994, freely available on the UNESCO website that you'll all be familiar with. It talks about the idea of having a representative, balanced and credible World Heritage List, and to ensure that the list reflects world, culture and natural diversity of outstanding universal value. Now, there are issues in this mission statement alone that I think could be challenged and could be explored, such as value. When we talk about value, whose value do we mean? But I'm not really going to unpick this statement here today. That's a more complex thing and beyond this paper. Now, since 1994, there have been various changes and amendments to the World Heritage Mission Statement, but the basic aim really remains the same. I think it's important to think critically about World Heritage listing. It isn't just an unalloyed blessing. And the first thing that I have a bit of problem with UNESCO and World Heritage is the fact that, as far as I'm aware, at least half of the world's population has always been female. There have always been women. And yet UNESCO uncritically uses mankind in all of its materials. I'd suggest that humankind would be better, much more inclusive, as that would clearly represent both women and men. A second thing that I think we should think critically about with World Heritage listing is the World Heritage focus on monumental and elite. Most of the world's population are not elite and have never been. Yet World Heritage sites around the world tend to be monumental. They tend to be the sites that were occupied or built by elites. And I think this is something that we should think about in terms of how we present heritage. There's also the onus on the state parties, who have never had who have power over selection. This means that they have the power to decide which sites are selected and why and on what basis. Now, this can be a good thing, but it can also mean that there is possibly sometimes a lack of objectivity. It also means that state parties have a huge burden in terms of finance and paperwork when inscribing a site or even getting a site towards inscription. Is there any such thing as World Heritage? That's a final point I'd like to raise, and I think it's something to think about. Can we actually say that there is a heritage that is applicable to the whole world? Do people in the diverse countries of the world value heritage in the same way? And do they value the same types of heritage? Now, there are, of course, advantages to World Heritage, and these include the prestige of World Heritage listing, belonging to a sort of exclusive club, if you like. World Heritage listing can help create identity and pride in communities and countries, and it can be part of an important common endeavour. And World Heritage listing can also provide help if a site is threatened by conflict, such things as the Blue Shield mark. And I have yet to notice a Blue Shield mark on Mackley, but it may bear the Blue Shield. But World Heritage can be a very good thing, but it is just important that I think that we need to think in an aware and critical way about anything that we're involved in. Now, perhaps the biggest benefit from World Heritage listing is tourism. And cultural tourism is a massive growth area with rising middle classes. Countries such as China and India bringing with them more monetary benefit. They have a rising demand for leisure pursuits, including cultural tourism and cultural travel. And World Heritage and UNESCO is in many ways an industry, and the UNESCO logo signals cultural products, sites, and also material objects. One thing that I think is interesting is the production of books by UNESCO. And you can see here that there's the 1,007 monuments in 2009. They're booked for sale for around about £25 or 3,450 Pakistan rupees. Now, of course, because more sites are inscribed all the time, in 2016 there are 1,031, so you need to buy a new book at the same very expensive price to be able to keep up with the World Heritage sites. Other publishers, and note that the book on the far side is not published by UNESCO, so it uses humankind rather than mankind, but it is a bit of a consumer industry, if you like. Now, there are many impacts of tourism, both good and bad. Some of the negative impacts include jobs being seasonal or poorly paid, and also needing to have an awareness of where local jobs, where money that's coming into an area might be disappearing if local industries are not being involved and local people are not being involved. There's also the possibility that cultures and traditions might change with outsiders coming in. There are also huge and major problems about tourist overcrowding and tourist stresses on sites. I think it's very important that any site intending to develop tourism and tourist numbers and attract more tourists should be aware of some of these problems. For example, tourists in Dubrovnik are now taking over the city at certain times of the year. They're flooding into the streets, and they're causing a lot of disruption to local people. Similar experiences throughout Europe are being recognized in cities such as Venice and Barcelona, where the huge amounts of tourists flooding into these cities mean that locals are not able to live in the cities anymore, they're being priced out. And the experience of being in these places, whether they are your home or whether you're there as a tourist, become rather unpleasant in the end. Other World Heritage Sites which are hugely popular, such as the Great Wall of China, is suffering record amounts of damage. Here is an article about a part of the wall, a third of the site being reduced to rubble. And next to it is an item about Machu Picchu, also a World Heritage Site, where increased tourism has resulted in tourists actually being limited in the numbers and times that they can go to the site in order to protect the very fabric of the site itself, as well as the authenticity of the experience of being there. So tourism can lead to overcrowding. It can ruin atmosphere and authenticity. We may go to a site for many different reasons, and many people come to a site such as Makli because it is a sacred site. They come for an authentic experience and a particular type of atmosphere. Yet, if there are too many visitors, too many tourists, it can ruin that atmosphere. We can suffer problems such as littering and overcrowding. Now to turn to this idea of public reception and Makli. In thinking about how Makli is widely understood, I Googled the site of Makli to find out what is out there. And one of the first sites that comes up is TripAdvisor, which is, a very commonly used site by Pakistani and international tourists to talk about different experiences. That's great. You get a mention at Makli and a site. In terms of public reception, well, there are something like 48 very positive reviews on TripAdvisor at the moment. There are some wonderful photos. There's also some discussion about some of the issues on the site. Now, these are two reviews that I pulled up in December 2017. They echo quite a lot of the other reviews on the site. And that is that this is a fabulous site. It's very interesting, very beautiful, very historic. There's a lack of information for tourists who visit here. Unless you actually know what you're seeing, it's very hard to learn more when you visit the site itself. The potential is great, said another reviewer, but there are problems around infrastructure, there are problems around finding things that you need whilst you're on the site. And most of the reviews that I read had similar themes about Makli, that it's a wonderful site, there's a lack of information, and there's a bit of a lack of infrastructure. Yet despite all of this, in my very scientific analysis of TripAdvisor, you see that there's a wide range of different nationalities still visiting the site. And this is despite another issue that was raised around actually security while getting to and around the site. So we have a vast number of people. I've figured out some of them are diaspora Pakistani really on the basis of names, but I think that this international reach is incredible given that there is actually really not a lot of information about Makli internationally available. I think it's excellent that Makli has avoided being placed on the World Heritage Endangered List. I think that's a real tribute to the hard work of so many people involved in this. And it's excellent that work is taking place to ensure that the site has a future. But just as Thomas mentioned about his work at Bamiyan, at the mosques and madrasa at Bamiyan, I think care is needed that spirit of place is not lost in renovation and restoration. We all know that. That's something I think we're all working towards. I think it's also important to remember that value and authenticity mean much more than the World Heritage definitions. And I think there's something that should be explored much more fully. And again, Professor Lari talked about this morning, I had some incredible examples. It's very important to involve and listen to different local communities, different people who might not be easy to access, but to get them involved in any developments and get them behind any developments is critical. So I think that there is a push within Sindh. I found various articles in Pakistan Today and other local newspapers about the idea that tourism is a real growth potential area in Sindh. And there's widespread recognition that there are problems. There's widespread recognition that there is huge potential. Because Sindh, just like the rest of Pakistan, has incredible heritage and natural sites. But unplanned and unregulated tourism can bring with it huge problems. And this is where, and a number of different speakers over the course of the last 2 days have talked about this, developing a really good site management plan, cultural resource management plan is essential for Makli as it is for any other site. Otherwise, unregulated tourism could risk the very things that make Makli so special. Now, we know that low intervention and protection puts sites at risk of decay and encroachment and weathering, so something has to be done. Things have to be done, and indeed things are being done. Now, the public do visit here, but they do note the lack of facilities and information, so I think that's something important to address. It is known internationally as a brilliant site, but it's best known to domestic tourists. And there is huge potential to develop it as a destination, obviously. But there are many risks with development, and all stakeholders, all of them, should be aware of these risks and decide together what is acceptable. But I think also, in putting together a cultural resource management plan or a site management plan, call it what you will, there are a lot of examples out there where other countries have made mistakes and done things wrong, and those are things we can learn from. Thank you.
Now it's turn to talk about moving in Makli, the politics of walking in 18th century Sindh. Mr. Shayan Rajani, who was born in Karachi, Pakistan. Shayan Rajani received a BA in Visual and Environmental Studies from Harvard University in 2009 and is currently a PhD student in history at Tufts University. His research interests include space and empire in the 19th century and the intersection of politics and religion in Pakistan. So the topic of his research paper is Moving in Makli, the politics of walking in the 18th century Sindh. Let me request and welcome Shayan Rajani to please come and to present his paper.
The practice of walking has been constitutive to and generative of the site of Makli. Its name is said to have come from a fakir whose journey to Makkah was foreshortened when he went into Hal on the hills. His declaration Hada Makkali, or this is Makkah for me, was eventually abbreviated to Makli. Everyday practices of walking by pilgrims and revelers extending back centuries sustained Makli as a sacred and recreational space. Even as antiquarian tours by colonial officials in the 19th century and the perambulations of historians, art historians, architects, and archaeologists since then have been key to producing Makli as a site of history made available to the Sindhi public, academia, and international and local conservation organizations. In this paper, I consider walking as a literary device in the Maklinama, an 18th century Persian praise poem about Makli written by Mir Ali Sher Khani. I argue that walking in the Maklinama is a mode of engagement with space that does not fully map onto the excursions of revelers or the expeditions of pilgrims. Instead, the journey of this text simulates the sensuous engagement of Persian-speaking male literary elite with a non-elite space of beauty and sacrality to cultivate an emotional sensibility. It draws on an older corpus of 17th century Mughal poems written in praise of Kashmir. Yet the innovations in Khani's style, as indeed his poetic mode of walking, is revealing of the transformations in the social and literary milieu of post-Mughal Thatta. Mir Ali Sher Khani was one of Sindh's most prolific Persian poets and certainly its most energetic Persian prose writer. Born in 1727-28, he spent most of his life in Thatta, where he died in 1788-89. Over the span of his life, he witnessed the transfer of sovereignty in Sindh from the Mughals to the Kalhora and finally the Talpurs, while suzerainty was transferred to Nadir Shah after 1739 and the Duranis after 1747. He lived through and wrote about the many bloody wars that accompanied these regime changes, while also watching the political and economic decline of Thatta, which after Mughal rule never again served as a seat of power. Divided into 9 parts, the Maklinama opens with the traditional praise of God and the Prophet, proceeds to praise Makli, and then embarks on a tour of the hills in the remaining 7 sections. While Khani is not explicit about the arc of the journey, with each section the poem drifts further southward, bringing a jaunt which starts at Pir Murad's tomb to a close outside the ruins of Kalankot. At the conclusion of the first section on the praise of God and Prophet Muhammad, Khani offers the following couplet, quote, "To go to this mountain is to be under the influence of wine. Come cupbearer, today is the tour of wine," end quote. The couplet should already alert us that this is no somber itinerary of Sufi shrines in Makli. Yet, in the second section, Kani invokes the most sacred sites of Islam to burnish Makli's credentials. He introduces Makli as a marvelous mountain of light whose grandeur causes Mount Sinai to burn anew with jealousy. He compares the sight of people visiting its mazars to pilgrims running between the hills of Safa and Marwa. Its name, Kani says, is Makli. The wine in its cup is Makkali, or like Makli, alluding to the origin story of Makli's name. Every night in Makli, he continues, is like the night of power, Laylatul Qadr, and every day in Makli like the day of Eid. The poetry that follows develops the idea of Makli as a paradise and also a place of pilgrimage, whose visit is no less in stature than the Hajj itself. This opening sequence alerts the reader that the mountain of Makli, upon whose tour they are about to embark, is no ordinary place, but rather a site of great sacrality and beauty. In the next section, Kani begins the tour of Makli and with the tombs of Pir Murad, Sayyid Muhammad Jamal, Sheikh Isa Languti, and Sheikh Hamad. Each site is described in a sentence or two of prose and then followed by praise poetry. Despite his keen interest in history, amply demonstrated in other works, Kani gives no historical information for any of these saints. Instead, the text simulates walking by moving from one site to those adjacent to it, pausing at each place to describe its appearance and locate it within its physical context. Sheikh Isa Languti's tomb is described as a high dome and an inaccessible dargah, situated to the left of Sayyid Muhammad Jamal. Its chabutra towers over the gardens of Samui, grazing the high heavens. For its beholders, its joy is equal to that of paradise. Around it, Kani continues, the land is green everywhere, with ponds and bodies of water accenting its beauty. After a poem in praise of this site, Kani tells of the festival that happens here on the 24th of every month. He praises the locks of the visitors which spin a web that ensnares the world. The beauty of the people at this festival adorns Makli, as the cyclical time of the monthly festival intersects with the rather more linear time of the stroll through the hills. In this manner, Kani continues his tour of Makli, moving from one site to another, rhapsodizing upon the buildings, the land and water, the festivals and activities that occur in various places. At the Mosque of Makli, he pauses to wax lyrical about the young students who visit it every Thursday accompanied by their teachers. He then proceeds to the tomb of Jam Nizamuddin, the pond next to it, the tombs of Pir Sheikh Joya, Pir Asad, the water bodies around these sites, the tomb of Khusro Khan, and the graveyard of Sheikh Penia, where a crowd of women come for pilgrimage every Thursday. Kani closes the third section with a heady description of Makli in rain. The next section moves through the tomb of Mirza Isa Tarkhan, the springs of Naransar and the pond of Barasar, a Hindu temple, and also gives a vivid description of the floodwaters that gather every year between Thatta and this site. The fifth section describes the pond of Khirsar and the people who visit it. The sixth section proceeds to the Jilwagai Imamain and its surrounding sites, the seventh to Zamine Mikra and its adjacent landmarks, the eighth to the ruins of Tughrilabad or Kalankot, and the ninth and final section to a description of the camp of Mullah Daud Dars. Despite the many comparisons that Kani deploys with the sacred geography of Islam, Makkah, Safa and Marwa, the Kaaba, Mount Sinai, and so on, Kani's tour of Makli is not restricted to sites that one would define narrowly as places of religious interest. He starts with tombs of saints like Pir Murad, Isa Languti, and Sheikh Hamad, but also includes descriptions of the tombs of sovereigns like the Sama ruler Jam Nizamuddin and the Tarkhan ruler Mirza Isa, as also the ruins of Kalankot and Hindu temples. Kani attends to numerous different water bodies around Makli. He even praises some specific trees. He describes in great detail the revelers on the banks of the Khirsar pond, as also the many other recreational spots around the hills. Makli is presented both as a God-created and human-created place, a site of natural and human beauty. The sites of Makli are all described through a constant evocation of the senses of sound, smell, taste, and sight. Kani describes the oral experience of the camp of Mullah Daud Dars, where qawwals played their melodies. The smell of the banks of Khirsar is such yavars that merchants from the cities of China bottle it as perfume. The taste of the spring of Khansar is so sweet that it renders Ab-e Zamzam brackish. When it comes to sight, Kani does not just describe the land, but also the buildings and people. The land is green in every direction, trees upon trees. Its beauty is such that one tour of Makli is equal to 100 tours of Kashmir. The banks of the pond of Khirsar are the dusty color of satin. The stones of Mirza Isa Khan's tomb with 1,000 carvings are a manifest sign of the power of God. The eyelashes of the women at Sheikh Periyan slay like the talons of the falcon. The realism of Kani's description heightens the sensuousness and immediacy of the more hyperbolic analogies. The scene at the banks of Khirsar is pictured in the following words, quote, "A crowd of men and women in every direction, tulip-faced singers on the banks of this pond happily playing the tambour. The footsteps of children, the clapping of sweet-voiced young women, noise in the heavens scattering in all directions. The moon-faced dancers, the minstrelsy of the fairy-faced, all mixed together in the sky. Young amrads and amrads besides themselves, moving in groups upon groups. The coquettish ones with faces like Gilman's strutting in troops," end quote. The scene that Kani sketches is by no means generic. Through an unwavering attention to the sights, sounds, and smells of these various sites, Kani vividly represents the pleasures of Makli. But the Makli Nama is not merely a walking tour conveying the physical and sensorial descriptions of the sights of Makli. Rather, Kani's ambition is to evoke a specific emotional experience by walking through Makli, a joyful exuberance that banishes sadness. This emotional experience is accessed through and stimulated by the sensuous and sensual. Consider, for example, the following passage describing Makli in the rain. "The billowing freshness of its land causes the garden of thought to bloom, and the joy-scattering purity of its water and earth causes the desire for delight to blossom. Its air laden with intoxicating joy, and its purity the heady nature of red wine. Its every stone washed and cleaned by rainwater, mirror-faced and fairy-countenanced, and everywhere here a paradise of sights of many, many fairy natures. Pleasure is a sea rebellious that carries the ship of the heart safely to the coast of salvation. When the sad hasten here, nothing but the wine of hope fills their cup of joy. When the poisoned step foot on this land, their body is purified of the fatal venom. Especially its tour gives joy, and naturally its sight gives sight to the light of God," end quote. Yet there is no contradiction in Makli Nama between the sensual admiration of women and men in Makli, or the sensuous appreciation of the beauty of the place and its sacral quality. The emotional impact of Makli upon visitors takes effect through the senses. Walking is the primary literary device by which Kani produces these emotions in the reader, facilitating a slow unfolding of the immersive experience of Makli. Each section title reaffirms this heady experience of ambling through Makli. The fifth section, which begins after a tour of Mirza Isa's tomb and its surrounds, has the long but moving title, "The ecstasy of this place dispelled, when insanity is cured, it is time to heighten the intoxication of amazement by the water of the pond of Khirsar. And when the goblet drunk see the splendor of this pond, they become filled to the brim again. And upon seeing the sweet movement of its waves on display, they return to playing the strings of the harp of joy," end quote. The penultimate section starts, quote, "The heart wants to hurry on to a tour of Tughril-Abad to receive joy from this emerald-like roseland. Hurry on, ebullient spectators and listeners," end quote. Each sight divulges its pleasures, and when the joyous effect of the place begins to wear, the heart urges the poet forward. Moreover, the binary between the sacral and profane is nowhere visible in the text or its titles. The sensuous and sensual come together to produce feelings of joy and happiness which are not easy to categorize either as religious or secular. Similarly, Noor, or the spiritual luminescence of God, radiates equally from the shrine of the Sufi Sayyid Muhammad Jamal and the tomb of the sovereign Isa Tarkhan. In this poem, beauty is the door to a pleasure that refuses the bounds of spiritual and material. While the mode of walking in Maklinama might at first recall the 19th century colonial practice of picturesque appreciation of nature, Kani is in fact engaging with an older Indo-Persianate genre of poetry of place. Sunil Sharma has recently brought attention to this corpus of 17th century Masnavis produced at the courts of Jahangir and Shah Jahan, which depict Kashmir as a Mughal paradise. That Kani has these Kashmir poems on his mind becomes evident when he alludes indirectly to these Masnavis at the end of Maklinama, admitting that reading the descriptions of spring in Kashmir spurred him to write his poem on Makli. He adds that while there is much on Kashmir and the Punjab, he is surprised that no one has yet written a description of Makli, which holds a status 100 times greater than that of Kashmir. While the copious Persian poetry on Kashmir's beauty may have goaded Kani on, he also shares many traits with Mughal court poets like Kaleem and Qudsi, who pioneered this genre. Foremost among these similarities is the common use of the literary device of touring or walking. Kaleem, Qudsi, and others led the reader on a tour of Kashmir, which often followed the journey of the Mughal emperor on his visit to the valley. Moreover, like these earlier poets, Kani too blends together the natural and the built environment, refusing the binary between a human-created urban space and God-created pristine natural space. Kani's vivid use of realism is also a commonality with poets of Kashmir who moved away from the generic imageries to describing specific sites in the valley. However, where Kashmir was described as a place of exemplary beauty by 17th century poets, Kani elaborates Makli between Makkah and Kashmir, which represent the idealized geographies of religious power and aesthetic refinement. As we have already seen, Makli's beauty and religious power were not kept distinct, but rather joined together. In Kani's formulation, Makli is not both beautiful like Kashmir and sacred like Makkah, but rather its beauty, which exceeds that of Kashmir, is the expression of and window into its sacrality, which equals Makkah. A second significant divergence between the Kashmir corpus and the Maklinama revolves around their relationship to political power. For Kaleem and Qudsi, the image of Kashmir as a garden related directly to the idea of the sovereign as gardener, and to notions of order and good government that were invoked by a sovereign's control of the natural environment. These 17th century Masnavis were a part of a larger project of power where control over nature was projected through hunting expeditions, botanical paintings, as also costly imperial trips to the valley of Kashmir. However, Maklinama remains decidedly unconcerned with sovereign power. Mughal rule was but a distant memory for Kani. Rather than centering the relationship of a sovereign cultivating a place, Kani centers the refined individual's cultivation of emotional experience by entering into a relationship with a place of deep familiarity. Developing an emotional self through a sensuous engagement with the place is a central concern of the Maklinama. Here, apprehending, experiencing, and feeling while walking is a valorized mode of individual conduct. The setting is also notably different from the usual poetic sites of self-cultivation such as the court, mushaira, garden, and bazaar. Rather than sohbat or the company of the refined and learned within a highly ordered setting, Maklinama locates the man of culture within the larger world, engaging with people outside rarefied literary circles. However, the mode of walking in Maklinama, focused as it is on the cultivation of emotions through observation, simultaneously distances the poet from his setting. The poet never really engages in revelry or pilgrimage, nor does he interact with the people or places he encounters. Walking, observing, and feeling are the main modes of engagement with the world around him. Maklinama then suggests that the cultivation of the emotional self within Persian-speaking people of learning also found expression in the 18th century in new settings, amidst non-elite society and non-urban spaces. This is not to imply that the ghazal, the primary vehicle of poetic sensibilities, or the mushaira, the primary setting for the ghazal, fell into decline in the 18th century. Kani himself wrote numerous ghazals and organized mushairas. However, the decline of Mughal sovereignty and the waning influence of political power both upon urban and literary life elite men of letters also turned towards new spaces, subjects, and modes of engagement, drawing creatively but selectively upon 17th century poetic relationships to non-urban and semi-urban spaces. In conclusion, the Makli-Nama brings attention to the significance of an emotive and sensuous relationship in 18th century Persian poetry to places that were not fully subject to the control and order demanded by classical aesthetics of power and literature. It is also indicative of a concerted effort to explicate Makli within Persian poetry by defining it between the idealized sacral and aesthetic geographies of Makkah and Kashmir. Moreover, while Makli remained a place of pilgrimage and revelry in the 18th century, it also became a medium for the cultivation of elite sensibilities of emotion through a sensuous experience of a world where the sacral and sensual were mutually implicated. As we in the modes of tourists and scholars incorporate Makli into our own world, this paper, I hope, reminds us of the varied modes of engagement through which Makli has historically found a place in the lives of the people of Sindh. Thank you.
Dr. Waleed Ziad is with us, our next scholar. From 2016 to 2017, Dr. Waleed Ziad was a research scholar in law and Islamic law and civilization research fellow at Yale Law School. He received his PhD with distinction in history at Yale University. His dissertation entitled Traveling the Indus and the Oxus, Trans-Original Islamic Revival in the Age of Political Fragmentation and the Great Game, 1747 to 1880, 797 pp, was awarded the university-wide Theron Rockwell Field Prize, one of the two most prestigious Yale dissertation awards awarded to two students selected from all the disciplines every year. At the intersection of historical social society, religious studies, and anthropology, Dr. Ziad's research concerns the historical and philosophical foundations of Muslim revivalism and the varying revivalists' responses in the internal political fragmentation and also colonialism and various aspects of the same subject. South and Central Asia and Iran was the focus. In this endeavor, in this effort, he has conducted field work on historical and contemporary Muslim revivalism, reform, and mysticism in over 90 towns across Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, and Turkey. The primary focus of his dissertation research was the development of the Naqshbandi Mujaddidi Sufi networks after the mid-18th century, spanning modern-day Afghanistan, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, India, China, and Russia. These were arguably the most extensive Muslim scholastic religious networks until 20th century. Dr. Ziad is also currently completing a monograph on an early medieval pilgrimage site concerned on a cave temple in the Saqqara Mountains range in the Pakistan-Afghanistan frontier, which is also called Sakra Mountain Range. This is found in Pakistan-Afghanistan frontier regions, which existed as the mandatory independent polity from the 4th to 11th centuries. Dr. Ziad's academic work has